The air in Terminal 3 smells like burnt coffee and jet fuel. A man in his mid-60s moves through the crowd with the deliberate gait of someone who has spent a lifetime reading rooms for danger. His suit is Italian, tailored years ago when money flowed easier and the future seemed secure. Now it hangs differently on his frame, weighted by something heavier than fabric. His hands are steady as he carries a single leather suitcase, but his eyes never stop moving. Gate numbers, exit signs, faces in the crowd, security personnel. Every person becomes a potential threat or witness in the calculus of survival he performs unconsciously. The mathematics of violence learned over 40 years in America's criminal underworld. It is July 29, 1977, and Jimmy Fratianno is about to commit an act so unthinkable, so fundamentally opposed to everything he has been taught to value, that it will reshape the entire architecture of organized crime in America. The FBI agents waiting for him near the departure lounge do not extend their hands. There is no camaraderie here, no warmth. One takes his suitcase without ceremony. The other gestures toward a service corridor away from public view. Fratianno follows without speaking. This is not a choice born of conscience or moral awakening. This is pure survival instinct. The same animal awareness that kept him alive through decades of mob warfare, now directing him toward the one path that does not end in a morgue. Within 72 hours, he will begin describing murders in such precise detail that prosecutors will use his testimony to dismantle criminal enterprises that have operated with impunity since the Depression. He will name names, reveal structures, expose secrets that powerful men killed to protect. He will become the single most damaging informant in the history of La Cosa Nostra, a weapon that federal authorities will deploy against mob families from Los Angeles to Cleveland to New York. But in this moment, walking through San Francisco International Airport flanked by men who have spent years trying to imprison him, Jimmy Fratianno is simply terrified. Because he knows exactly what happens to rats. He has personally killed men for far less than what he is about to do. The neighborhood where Aladina Fratianno spent his childhood no longer exists in the form he would remember. The Collinwood section of Cleveland's East Side in the 1920s was a place where old-world Italy collided with industrial America, where Sicilian dialects mixed with English in the streets, where immigrant families struggled to transform poverty into something resembling opportunity. The Fratiannos arrived from Naples when their son was barely walking, part of the great wave of Southern Italian immigration that saw millions flee poverty and limited prospects for the uncertain promise of America. They settled among their own kind, in neighborhoods where the social structures of the old country persisted, even as the second generation learned to speak English without accents and dream American dreams. Young Jimmy absorbed the lessons of his environment quickly. He saw that legitimate work offered his father little dignity and less money. He watched the factory workers return home exhausted, aging prematurely, gaining nothing but calluses and diminished health. But the bootleggers, the men who operated in the shadows of Prohibition-era Cleveland, they wore suits and drove automobiles and commanded a respect that manual labor never earned. The mathematics were simple, even to a teenage boy. Crime paid better than honesty, and respect flowed to those willing to break laws that seemed arbitrary anyway. He quit school at 14, worked briefly at jobs that taught him nothing except that he wanted something different, something more. He began running errands for local criminals, small tasks that required discretion rather than violence, delivering packages, carrying messages, standing watch while meetings occurred behind closed doors. He learned to be reliable, to keep his mouth shut, to follow instructions precisely. These were the fundamental skills that would carry him through 4 decades in organized crime, more valuable than the ability to pull a trigger or throw a punch. Cleveland in the Depression years was a city of sudden violence and competing criminal factions. The bootlegging industry generated enormous profits, and profits always attracted predators. Irish gangs, Jewish syndicates, and Italian organizations fought for control of territory, distribution networks, and political protection. Murders occurred regularly, bodies found in alleys or burned-out automobiles or at the bottom of Lake Erie. Fratianno witnessed this violence and understood its purpose. This was not random cruelty or psychological pathology. This was business communication, the way ambitious men resolved disputes when courts and contracts could not be invoked. He participated in his first serious crimes in his late teens: robberies, burglaries, hijacking trucks carrying goods that could be fenced for ready cash. He was arrested multiple times, but avoided serious prison time through a combination of lawyer skill and the corruption that permeated Cleveland's justice system: prosecutors who could be bribed, police officers willing to lose evidence, judges who understood the value of looking the other way at opportune moments. He developed a reputation as someone who could be trusted, who would not panic when situations became violent, who understood that cooperation with authorities meant death. This reputation mattered more than any particular criminal skill. The Mafia valued loyalty above everything else, because betrayal destroyed organizations from within. A reliable soldier who kept secrets was worth far more than a talented criminal who might talk. The murder happened in circumstances that Fratianno would later describe vaguely, offering just enough detail to confirm it occurred without providing information that could result in prosecution. The victim was another criminal, someone who had violated an agreement or threatened the wrong people, or simply been in a place where his continued existence became inconvenient. The specifics mattered less than the psychological threshold being crossed. Fratianno had killed. He had demonstrated the ultimate form of loyalty to organized crime, the willingness to take human life in service of organizational interests. He would later claim to feel no particular emotion about this first murder, no haunting guilt or psychological burden. The victim was a criminal who understood the risks of the life he chose. In Fratianno's worldview, shaped by decades in an environment where violence was routine, this killing was simply necessary business. Some problems required permanent solutions. He was willing to provide them. This willingness would define his criminal career, opening doors that remained closed to associates unwilling to commit murder. But it also marked him in ways he would not understand until much later. Every killing created witnesses, evidence, exposure. Every murder gave the law another reason to pursue you, and gave your own organization another reason to consider whether you knew too much to be allowed to live. Los Angeles, in 1946, was experiencing the kind of explosive growth that creates opportunities for those quick enough to exploit them. The war had ended, soldiers were returning home, the aerospace and entertainment industries were expanding, and population was flooding into Southern California at a rate that strained infrastructure and created vacuums in criminal operations. Fratianno arrived with his wife and the kind of calculated ambition that recognized Los Angeles as territory ripe for exploitation. The Cleveland mob was constrained by geography and competition, but California seemed limitless. The Los Angeles crime family was controlled by Jack Dragna, a Sicilian immigrant who had consolidated power during the Prohibition years and maintained it through political connections and relationships with the Eastern families. Dragna ran his organization with old-world conservatism, avoiding unnecessary attention, maintaining respect for traditions, operating rackets that generated steady income without attracting federal scrutiny. He controlled bookmaking operations, loan-sharking networks, labor racketeering in the construction and entertainment industries, and various forms of extortion that business owners paid to avoid having their establishments burned or bombed. Fratianno approached Dragna with proper protocol, carrying introductions from Cleveland mobsters who could vouch for his capabilities and his reliability. Dragna accepted him initially as an associate, allowing him to operate but withholding full membership until Fratianno could demonstrate his value to the Los Angeles organization. The test was not difficult. Fratianno threw himself into California criminal opportunities with an energy that impressed the older, more cautious members of the Dragna family. He operated card games and dice games in back rooms and warehouses, running professional gambling operations that took thousands of dollars nightly from players who could afford to lose. He participated in hijackings of trucks carrying valuable cargo, cigarettes and liquor, and electronics that could be sold through fences for substantial profit. Most importantly, he became involved in labor racketeering, the systematic infiltration and exploitation of unions that would become his specialty and his greatest source of income. The ceremony occurred in 1947 in a private home with windows covered and doors guarded against unexpected interruptions. The men present were made members of the Los Angeles crime family, soldiers and captains who had earned their positions through violence and demonstrated loyalty. Fratianno took the oath that formalized his membership in La Cosa Nostra, swearing allegiance to the organization above all other obligations, promising never to reveal secrets or cooperate with authorities, accepting that the penalty for betrayal was death. His finger was pricked with a needle, blood drawn and mixed with the blood of other members, a ritual that symbolized the permanent bond being created. He was now a made man, a full member with all the protections and obligations that status conferred. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Fratianno had achieved something that tens of thousands of Italian-American criminals aspired to, but would never obtain. Membership in La Cosa Nostra was restricted, offered only to men of Italian descent who had demonstrated both criminal capability and absolute reliability. Made members could not be killed without permission from organizational leadership. They had earning rights in various rackets. They commanded respect from associates and criminals outside the organization. They were, within their world, nobility. But this status also created vulnerabilities that Fratianno would not recognize for decades. As a made member, he was now bound by rules he had not written and could not change. His life belonged to the organization in ways that transcended metaphor. If bosses decided he was a liability, if they suspected disloyalty, or determined his usefulness had expired, they could order his execution, and other members would be obligated to carry it out. The oath he swore created a prison more absolute than any built by government. He could never leave, never retire, never choose a different path. The only exits from La Cosa Nostra were death or betrayal, and betrayal meant death anyway. The International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees represented workers who built sets, operated cameras, managed lighting and sound equipment, projected films in theaters. These were skilled positions that paid decent wages, and the unions that represented these workers controlled access to employment in an industry generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The potential for exploitation was enormous. The Dragna family had been working Hollywood rackets since the 1930s, but Fratianno brought new sophistication and ruthlessness to these operations. The strategy was multi-layered. First, place mob associates in union leadership positions through a combination of legitimate election victories and violent intimidation of opponents. Second, use union control to extort money from studios by threatening strikes that would halt production and cost millions in delays. Third, divert union pension funds through sweetheart loans to mob-controlled businesses that paid kickbacks and often defaulted entirely. Fourth, provide protection services to producers and stars who wanted problems solved discreetly, creating relationships that could be exploited for future favors. Fratianno cultivated relationships with Sidney Korshak, the Chicago lawyer whose client list included both major studios and the most powerful mob families in America. Korshak operated at the intersection of legitimate business and organized crime, too sophisticated to participate directly in violence but perfectly willing to broker deals that benefited his criminal associates. Through Korshak and others, Fratianno gained access to Hollywood's power structure, attending parties at Beverly Hills estates, meeting actors and directors and producers who either did not know or did not care about his criminal background. He was charming when necessary, offering favors and solving problems that legitimate channels could not address.
He helped secure financing for independent productions, investing mob money in films that might generate profits or at least provide vehicles for money laundering. He resolved labor disputes that threatened production schedules, using his union connections to prevent strikes or end work stoppages.
And when charm failed, when someone proved uncooperative or threatened profitable arrangements, he used violence with the same calculation he applied to every other aspect of his criminal career. The bodies were found in various locations over the years, victims whose murders would remain officially unsolved even as law enforcement suspected mob involvement. Fratianno's role in these killings would not be confirmed until he began cooperating with federal authorities decades later, when he provided details that only the killer could know. The methodology was consistent. Victims were typically fellow criminals who had violated organizational rules or threatened mob interests. They were lured to isolated locations under false pretenses, ambushed, and killed efficiently. Some were shot multiple times. Others were strangled. Bodies were sometimes left as warnings, other times hidden to delay discovery and complicate investigations. One murder involved a Los Angeles mobster suspected of providing information to law enforcement. Dragna ordered the problem eliminated. Fratianno and an associate lured the target to a remote area, explaining they needed to discuss business away from potential surveillance. When the victim arrived, Fratianno shot him at close range, multiple shots to ensure death was immediate. They left the body in the desert, where it was discovered days later by hikers. Police investigated but could not develop evidence sufficient for prosecution. Witnesses who might have provided information declined to cooperate. The case went cold. Another killing occurred in Cleveland, when Fratianno was asked to participate in eliminating a member of the local family who had fallen out of favor with leadership. Fratianno traveled to Ohio, met with the hit team, and helped lure the victim to an apartment where he was shot to death. Again, the investigation failed to produce arrests. These were not crimes of passion or psychological compulsion. Fratianno killed because the organization ordered it, approaching murder as a job requirement no different from any other aspect of his criminal responsibilities. He felt no particular enjoyment in taking life, but neither did he experience remorse or moral conflict. The victims were criminals who knew the rules and accepted the consequences. But murder creates its own complications. Every killing leaves evidence, witnesses, opportunities for law enforcement to develop cases. Every victim has associates who might seek revenge or provide information to authorities. And every murder demonstrates to your own organization that you are capable of killing, which eventually raises questions about what you might do to survive if your own life is threatened. Las Vegas in the 1950s was being built with mob money, Teamster pension funds, and the vision of criminals who recognized that legal gambling in Nevada could generate profits that dwarfed traditional rackets. The casinos rising along the Strip were nominally owned by legitimate businesses, but the reality was that multiple crime families held hidden interests in various properties. These interests generated enormous profits through the skim, the systematic theft of casino revenue before it could be counted and taxed by state authorities. Fratianno became deeply involved in Las Vegas operations through his relationships with mobsters from Chicago, New York, Cleveland, and other cities. He helped arrange financing from union pension funds that mob associates controlled, directing millions of dollars in loans to casinos where the families held secret interests. He assisted in placing trusted individuals in key management positions within casino operations, particularly in the counting rooms where revenue was tallied and skimmed. He served as an enforcer, traveling to Vegas when problems arose that required violence or the threat of violence to resolve. The skim operation was elegantly simple. Casino revenue came from gambling, primarily slot machines and table games. This money was supposed to be counted in the casino's counting room, recorded accurately, and reported to Nevada gaming authorities who taxed it. But before official counting occurred, trusted employees removed cash, skimming it off the top. This money was then divided among the crime families that held interests in the casino, transported out of state through various means, and distributed to bosses who avoided taxation entirely. The amounts were staggering.
A single major casino might generate hundreds of thousands of dollars monthly in skim revenue. Multiply that across multiple properties over many years, and the total approaches hundreds of millions of dollars in untaxed criminal profits. This money financed mob operations nationwide, providing capital for loan sharking, drug trafficking, labor racketeering, and bribing of public officials. Fratianno's role combined logistics and violence. He helped identify casino employees who could be trusted with skim operations, or more accurately, employees who could be corrupted or intimidated into cooperation.
He occasionally served as a courier, transporting skim money to mob bosses in other cities, carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash on commercial flights in an era when airport security was minimal. He attended meetings where skim percentages were negotiated among families, using his diplomatic skills to prevent disputes from escalating into warfare. And when problems arose, when an employee became unreliable or a witness needed to be eliminated, Fratianno provided the violence that kept the skim operating smoothly. Las Vegas introduced Fratianno to the complex politics of multifamily mob operations. Unlike traditional territories controlled by a single organization, Vegas was a shared enterprise where families from across the country held overlapping interests. This required constant negotiation, compromise, and careful management of competing claims. Disputes over skim percentages, casino control, and territorial boundaries had to be resolved through discussion rather than immediate violence, though violence remained an option when negotiation failed. Fratianno proved adept at navigating this environment. He was personable when necessary, intimidating when appropriate, and always calculating the angles. He built relationships with bosses from different families, becoming known as someone who could be trusted to represent interests fairly. This reputation made him increasingly valuable and elevated his status within the national mob structure. He traveled constantly during the 1960s, flying from Los Angeles to Las Vegas to Chicago to New York, attending meetings, conducting business, occasionally committing murders on behalf of different families. He was no longer simply a Los Angeles soldier, but rather a national figure with connections and influence across multiple organizations. This prominence brought both opportunities and increasing danger. He was earning more money than he had imagined possible as a young Cleveland criminal. He had more power and respect than most mob members ever achieved. But he was also accumulating enemies, bosses who resented his success, associates who coveted his position, and law enforcement agencies that were beginning to understand the scope of organized crime's Las Vegas operations. The FBI was conducting surveillance, gathering intelligence, developing informants. The federal government was beginning to recognize that traditional law enforcement methods were insufficient to combat organizations as sophisticated and well-funded as the American Mafia. New laws, new investigative techniques, new resources were being deployed. The certainties that had protected organized crime for decades were eroding. The bodies accumulated over the years, a trail of violence that Fratianno would later describe with chilling precision. He admitted to at least 5 murders, though the actual number almost certainly exceeded that total. Some killings were never discovered, bodies hidden so effectively that victims simply disappeared. Other murders were attributed to different killers, part of the general violence that characterized mob operations in multiple cities. The victims shared certain characteristics. They were almost always fellow criminals who had violated mafia rules or threatened organizational interests. They were men who had been warned, given opportunities to correct their behavior, and ultimately deemed too dangerous to allow to continue living. The murders were typically planned carefully, not crimes of passion, but calculated eliminations designed to send messages and solve problems. One particularly notorious killing involved a Cleveland mobster who had fallen into disfavor with local family leadership. Fratianno was asked to participate because of his Cleveland connections and his reputation for reliability in violent situations. He traveled to Ohio, met with the hit team, and helped devise a plan to lure the victim to an isolated location.
The victim was told that a meeting was necessary to resolve a business dispute. When he arrived, he was ambushed and shot multiple times. The body was disposed of in a way that prevented discovery for several days, providing the killers time to establish alibis and distance themselves from the crime scene. The murder was investigated but never officially solved. Another killing occurred in Los Angeles, ordered by Jack Dragna, who suspected a family member of providing information to law enforcement. The evidence was circumstantial, but Dragna believed the risk was too great to ignore. Fratianno and another soldier carried out the execution, shooting the victim and leaving the body where it would be discovered quickly as a warning to others who might consider cooperating with authorities. These murders were not committed by a psychopath who enjoyed killing. Fratianno approached violence as a professional requirement, no different from any other aspect of his criminal career. He did not seek out opportunities to kill, did not fantasize about violence, did not experience pleasure from taking life. But neither did he feel meaningful remorse or moral conflict. The victims were criminals who understood the world they inhabited and accepted the risks that came with that choice.
They violated rules or threatened interests, and they faced consequences. In Fratianno's worldview, shaped by 4 decades in an environment where violence was routine and life was cheap, these killings were simply necessary business. But murder creates psychological burdens even for those who claim not to feel them. Living with the knowledge that you have taken lives changes something fundamental in human psychology. And beyond the personal psychological impact, murder creates practical vulnerabilities. Every killing leaves evidence, creates witnesses, provides law enforcement with opportunities to develop cases. Every victim has family, friends, associates who might someday seek revenge or provide testimony. And every murder demonstrates to your own organization that you are capable of killing, which eventually raises uncomfortable questions about what you might do to survive if your life is threatened. By the mid-1970s, Jimmy Fratianno had become a liability to the very organization he had served so faithfully. He knew too much about too many murders, too many illegal operations, too many secrets. And as federal pressure intensified, as law enforcement agencies developed new investigative capabilities and began flipping lower-level criminals into informants, the mob leadership began to question whether Fratianno could be trusted to remain silent if arrested and facing life in prison. Jack Dragna died in 1956, and the Los Angeles crime family passed through several leaders, each seemingly weaker than the last. By the mid-1970s, the family was in obvious decline, beset by internal conflicts, aggressive law enforcement pressure, and competition from other criminal organizations. The current boss, Dominic Brooklier, was facing federal indictment on charges that would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence. The family needed someone to serve as acting boss during Brooklier's legal battles. In 1975, Jimmy Fratianno was appointed to that position. This represented the absolute peak of his criminal career. He was now the leader, however temporarily, of one of the oldest mafia families in America. He had authority over dozens of made numbers and hundreds of associates. He controlled rackets generating millions of dollars annually in Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and other cities. He represented the Los Angeles family in dealings with other organizations, sitting down with bosses from New York, Chicago, and other major families to negotiate disputes and business arrangements. But the position was precarious in ways Fratianno understood immediately. He was acting boss precisely because the real boss was incapacitated by legal problems. When Brooklier's situation was resolved, either through acquittal or after serving whatever sentence he received, Fratianno would be expected to step aside gracefully and return to his previous status. Any reluctance to relinquish power would be viewed as insubordination and disloyalty, potentially punishable by death. Moreover, some family members resented his promotion, believing others deserved the position. These internal enemies waited for opportunities to undermine him, reporting real or invented complaints to other families, poisoning his reputation through whisper campaigns.
Fratianno attempted to consolidate his position through aggressive expansion of family operations. He pursued new casino skimming opportunities in Las Vegas.
He expanded labor racketeering into industries the family had not previously controlled. He ordered murders of rivals and potential informants, trying to demonstrate the kind of ruthless strength that commanded respect. But the challenges were overwhelming. The Los Angeles family was weak compared to Eastern organizations, lacking the political connections, financial resources, and manpower to compete effectively. The glory days when Jack Dragna commanded genuine fear and respect were long past. The family had become a regional operation, struggling to maintain relevance in an era when the entire structure of American organized crime was changing. Federal law enforcement was deploying new weapons against organized crime by the mid-1970s. The Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, allowed prosecutors to charge entire criminal enterprises rather than just individual crimes. Wiretaps were capturing conversations that revealed organizational structures and criminal activities. Electronic surveillance penetrated mob meetings that had always been considered secure. Most damaging, the FBI was developing informants within mob families, flipping low-level criminals who provided testimony about higher-ranking members in exchange for reduced sentences. In 1976, Fratianno learned that he was a primary target of a massive FBI investigation spanning multiple cities and involving dozens of agents. The Bureau was gathering evidence about his role in murders, extortion, labor racketeering, and casino skimming operations. Informants were providing testimony. Wiretaps were capturing his conversations. Financial records were being subpoenaed and analyzed. The FBI was building a comprehensive case that could result in multiple life sentences and ensure he died in federal prison. Fratianno's initial response was to tighten security. He reduced face-to-face meetings, using payphones and coded language to discuss criminal business. He attempted to identify informants within the family, questioning associates about their contacts with law enforcement. He ordered the murder of anyone suspected of cooperation with authorities, believing that eliminating potential witnesses would prevent prosecution. But the paranoia spread beyond the FBI investigation. Fratianno began hearing rumors from his network of contacts in other cities. The national Mafia leadership, the commission that governed relationships between families, had discussed his situation. Word was circulating that Fratianno was too exposed, too vulnerable to prosecution, too likely to cooperate if arrested and facing life imprisonment. The ultimate decision had not been made officially, but the direction was clear. Jimmy Fratianno had become a liability. Other mobsters began distancing themselves, refusing to meet with him, ignoring his phone calls. Associates who had been reliable for years suddenly had excuses why they could not attend meetings or complete assignments. These were the signs that preceded execution, the organizational signals that someone's time had expired. The realization came gradually, building over months until it could no longer be denied. The Mafia was preparing to kill him. The organization he had served for 30 years, the brotherhood he had committed murders to protect, the family he had sworn loyalty to above all else, had decided he was expendable. His decades of faithful service meant nothing. His countless crimes on behalf of the organization were irrelevant. He was perceived as a threat to mob interests, and the Mafia eliminated threats without sentimentality or hesitation. Fratianno faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could wait for assassination, hoping his suspicions were wrong, gambling that the organization would decide he remained valuable. He could attempt to flee and live in hiding, constantly watching for hitmen, knowing that the mob had patience and resources to hunt him indefinitely. Or he could do the unthinkable. He could become what he had always despised. He could become a rat. The decision did not happen in a single moment of moral clarity. There was no epiphany, no sudden recognition that crime was wrong and cooperation with authorities was righteous. This was pure calculation, survival instinct overriding decades of conditioning. Fratianno was 63 years old, too old to run forever, too old to fight effectively if assassination teams came for him. He thought about prison, spending his remaining years in a cell,
probably murdered by mob associates even behind bars. He thought about his wife, his grandchildren, the people who depended on him. And he thought about dying violently in some parking lot or restaurant or hotel room, bleeding out on concrete while his killers disappeared into the night. In July 1977, through an intermediary he believed could be trusted, Fratianno sent a message to the FBI. He was willing to discuss cooperation. The response was immediate. FBI agents who had spent years investigating him recognized the opportunity instantly. Fratianno was the acting boss of a major crime family. He had knowledge spanning decades of organized crime operations. He had participated in murders, overseen racketeering schemes, attended high-level meetings where mob business was discussed. His testimony could result in hundreds of convictions and dismantle criminal enterprises that had operated with impunity for generations. The negotiations occurred over several weeks in secure locations with layers of security designed to prevent mob hitmen from learning about the discussions. Fratianno demanded witness protection, relocation for his family, financial support, and immunity from prosecution for most of his crimes. The FBI offered protection and relocation, but insisted that Fratianno must testify truthfully and completely. Any lies, any withholding of significant information would void the agreement and expose him to full prosecution on charges that could result in life imprisonment. The deal was controversial from the beginning. Fratianno was a killer who had murdered at least 5 people, possibly many more. He had committed countless other crimes, destroyed lives, corrupted institutions, and enriched himself through violence and extortion for 40 years. Offering him any form of immunity or reduced sentences meant that he would avoid the full consequences of his actions, while his victims and their families received no justice. But federal prosecutors made a calculated decision. Fratianno's testimony was worth the moral compromise. His knowledge could dismantle crime families, convict dozens or hundreds of mobsters, and demonstrate that the supposedly sacred code of omertà could be broken when self-interest demanded it. The precedent would be valuable even beyond the immediate convictions, showing other mobsters that cooperation was possible and that the organization would not protect them if they became liabilities.
On July 29, 1977, at San Francisco International Airport, the deal was finalized. Jimmy Fratianno boarded a plane with FBI agents and disappeared into federal protection. His old life was over. His identity would change. He would never again walk freely in the neighborhoods where he once commanded respect and fear. The Mafia's response was immediate and furious. Word spread through the criminal underworld within hours. Jimmy Fratianno had flipped. The Weasel, the nickname that had followed him for decades because of his ability to slip out of trouble, was cooperating with federal authorities. Every boss, every soldier, every associate who had ever worked with Fratianno suddenly faced potential prosecution. Conversations they had years earlier, crimes they committed together, secrets they shared, all of it was now in FBI hands. The National Commission issued a contract on Fratianno's life. Reports suggested the bounty reached $1 million, an extraordinary sum that reflected both the magnitude of his betrayal and the desperation of mob leadership to silence him. Every Mafia family in America mobilized resources to locate him. Hitmen were activated. Associates who might know his location were questioned aggressively. But Fratianno was protected by the full resources of the federal government. He was hidden in safe houses that changed regularly. His identity was concealed. FBI agents provided round-the-clock security. The Mafia, despite its extensive resources and nationwide reach, could not find him. And Fratianno kept talking. The debriefings continued for months. FBI agents extracting every detail of his criminal career. He described organizational structures, identifying bosses and captains and soldiers in multiple families.
He admitted to murders he had committed and murders he knew about, providing details that only someone present could know. He explained how criminal rackets operated, the mechanics of casino skimming, labor racketeering,
extortion, corruption of public officials. He identified politicians and judges and police officers who had accepted bribes. He revealed the sophisticated methods organized crime used to launder money, conceal assets, and avoid taxation. The prosecutions began in 1978 and continued through the early 1980s. Jimmy Fratianno testified in multiple trials across the country, providing evidence that resulted in dozens of convictions. His testimony was devastating, detailed, and mostly truthful. He described murders with the kind of precision that could only come from direct participation. He identified bosses who ordered killings, explained organizational structures that had been suspected but never confirmed, revealed relationships between seemingly independent criminal enterprises. Defense attorneys attacked his credibility relentlessly. They pointed out, correctly, that he was a killer testifying to save himself from prison. They argued that his testimony was bought and paid for by prosecutors offering leniency. They noted that he had committed terrible crimes, while his victims' families would never see justice. They portrayed him as a liar willing to say anything to avoid punishment. But the testimony held up under cross-examination. Physical evidence corroborated his accounts. Other witnesses confirmed details he provided. Wiretaps and surveillance logs matched his descriptions of meetings and criminal activities.
Juries believed him, not because they liked him or found him sympathetic, but because his testimony was demonstrably truthful. In Los Angeles, Fratianno testified against members of his former family, including Dominic Brooklier and other high-ranking members. He described murders, explained extortion schemes, detailed labor racketeering operations. His testimony, combined with other evidence, resulted in multiple convictions that effectively destroyed the Los Angeles crime family as a functioning organization. In San Francisco, he provided crucial evidence against bosses and soldiers involved in murder and racketeering. Again, convictions followed, crippling another mob family. In Cleveland, where his criminal career had begun, Fratianno testified about murders and organized crime activities dating back to the 1960s. Cleveland mobsters who believed they were safe from prosecution for decades-old crimes suddenly faced life sentences based on his detailed testimony. The trials attracted massive media coverage. Fratianno was portrayed as both villain and witness, a killer who murdered for profit, now claiming a form of moral authority by testifying against former associates. Journalists documented his crimes while also reporting the damage his testimony inflicted on organized crime. The contradiction was never resolved. He was simultaneously a monster who deserved punishment and a valuable witness whose cooperation served justice. But from the FBI's perspective, the calculation was clear. Fratianno's testimony was dismantling crime families that had operated with impunity for generations. The Code of Omertà, which for decades had protected organized crime from prosecution by ensuring that members would die rather than cooperate, was revealed as mythology. If the acting boss of a major family could break the code when his survival demanded it, then omertà was merely a useful fiction that crumbled under sufficient pressure. In 1981, Fratianno published a memoir titled The Last Mafioso, written with journalist Ovid Damaris. The book became a bestseller, providing unprecedented detail about mafia operations, murders, and internal politics. It described his criminal career, his decision to cooperate, and his justifications for betrayal. The book was controversial from publication. Victims' families protested that Fratianno was profiting from his crimes, receiving money and attention while their loved ones were dead. Critics argued that the book glorified violence and organized crime, presenting mob life as exciting and dramatic rather than brutal and destructive. Some questioned whether Fratianno was telling the truth or embellishing for dramatic effect and commercial success. But the book was undeniably compelling. Fratianno described murders with disturbing matter-of-factness, explaining the mechanics of killing without apparent emotion. He revealed mafia rituals, codes, and decision-making processes that had been protected secrets. He portrayed organized crime not as a romantic brotherhood, but as a brutal business where life was cheap and loyalty lasted only until self-interest dictated otherwise.
The Last Mafioso became a primary source for subsequent books, films, and documentaries about organized crime. It established Fratianno as perhaps the most famous mafia informant in American history, surpassing even Joseph Valachi, who had testified before Congress in the 1960s. But the book also ensured that Fratianno would never be safe.
Every copy sold reminded the Mafia that he was alive and thriving despite his betrayal. Every interview he gave, every public appearance, was a reminder that he had violated the most sacred rule and prospered from it. The million-dollar contract on his life remained active. Somewhere, someone was still looking for him. Fratianno lived in witness protection for the rest of his life, relocated multiple times as security concerns dictated. He adopted new identities, lived quietly in undisclosed locations, avoided public exposure whenever possible. The FBI continued protecting him, recognizing that his murder would discourage future cooperating witnesses and send a message that the mob could still reach informants despite federal protection. He died on June 30, 1993, at age 79, of natural causes. He died in bed, surrounded by family, having avoided the violent death that claimed so many of his former associates. His death was reported in newspapers across the country. Obituaries described him as the highest-ranking mafia member to ever turn federal informant, a killer who became a witness, a man who broke the code and survived. The mafia's reaction to his death was muted. By 1993, many of the men he had betrayed were already dead or imprisoned. The families he helped destroy had not recovered. Organized crime itself was in decline, beset by aggressive federal prosecutions facilitated by RICO statutes, the proliferation of informants following the precedent Fratianno established, and changing criminal markets that reduced the profitability of traditional rackets. In a sense, Fratianno's cooperation was both symptom and cause of the mafia's decline. He flipped because the organization was weak enough and paranoid enough to consider killing one of its most valuable members. His testimony weakened it further, demonstrating that even senior leaders would cooperate when survival demanded it. His success as an informant encouraged others to follow his path, creating a cascade of cooperation that continues to this day. More than 3 decades after his death, Jimmy Fratianno remains a controversial and contested figure. To law enforcement, he represents a crucial breakthrough, proof that even the most hardened criminals will cooperate under the right circumstances. His testimony provided a template for developing high-level informants and demonstrated the value of offering deals to serious criminals in exchange for testimony against criminal organizations. To prosecutors, he showed that insider testimony, despite its moral complications and the distasteful necessity of offering leniency to murderers, can dismantle criminal enterprises that conventional investigation cannot touch. To the general public, particularly those who consume true crime content, he embodies the fascinating paradox of the criminal turned witness, the insider who reveals secrets, the betrayer who claims justification. But to the Mafia, to the diminished remnants of an organization he helped destroy, Jimmy Fratianno will always be the Weasel. He will always be the rat who chose survival over honor, who valued his own life above all other considerations, who committed the unforgivable sin of betrayal and not only survived but prospered. His name will be invoked for generations in mob circles as the ultimate example of treachery, a cautionary tale about what happens when self-preservation overrides all other values. The judgment of history is more nuanced and more damning than either his defenders or detractors might acknowledge. Fratianno was a killer who admitted to at least 5 murders and likely committed more. He terrorized honest citizens, corrupted institutions, enriched himself through violence and extortion for 40 years. He caused immeasurable suffering to victims and their families. He deserves no sympathy for his criminal acts, no forgiveness for the lives he destroyed. But his decision to cooperate, however motivated by self-preservation rather than conscience, resulted in the conviction of dozens of violent criminals and the dismantling of multiple organized crime families. His testimony exposed the reality of the Mafia, stripping away romantic mythology and revealing the brutal business underneath. His cooperation established a precedent that continues to this day, demonstrating that the supposedly unbreakable code of omertà breaks when sufficient pressure is applied. The ultimate irony is that Fratianno survived by doing what the Mafia most feared, by becoming what he had spent 40 years despising. He lived long enough to see the organization he betrayed diminished almost to irrelevance in the cities where it once operated with impunity. He avoided prison and violent death. He profited from books and media appearances. In the world of organized crime, where loyalty is demanded but rarely reciprocated, where honor is proclaimed but seldom practiced, where death is the penalty for disloyalty but execution is ordered casually when convenience demands it, Jimmy the Weasel Fratianno made the ultimate calculation. He chose life over death, cooperation over execution, survival over a code that the organization itself honored only when expedient. And he lived with that choice until natural causes claimed him at 79, an outcome denied to so many of the men he served beside, murdered with, and ultimately betrayed. The airport terminal where this story began exists now only in photographs and memories. The man who walked through it that July afternoon in 1977 has been dead for more than 3 decades. But the consequences of his decision ripple forward still, shaping how law enforcement pursues organized crime, how criminals calculate the odds of cooperation, how the mythology of honor among thieves collides with the reality of self-interest. In the end, Jimmy Fratianno's legacy is written not in the crimes he committed or the men he killed, but in the secrets he revealed and the precedent he established. He proved that even the Mafia's most sacred codes are negotiable, that survival can overcome decades of conditioning, that the supposedly eternal bond of La Cosa Nostra is as fragile as any human loyalty when tested by the prospect of life or death. He was the weasel who survived by doing what weasels do, adapting when circumstances demanded it, choosing the path that kept him alive regardless of cost. History will remember him not as a hero or a villain, but as something more complicated and more human, a killer who chose survival when the organization that promised to protect him decided he had become expendable. In that choice, he destroyed the myth that the Mafia existed on, while exposing the brutal calculus that actually governed its operations. And for that revelation, both law enforcement and organized crime will remember his name long after the specifics of his crimes have faded from memory.